I, 25, female, always believed in helping family, but I also believed in boundaries. Working from home meant long hours in front of a screen, constant focus, and the ability to jump into multiple meetings together. It wasn't an easy setup, but it worked for me. Until my sister-in-law Melanie, 28, female, showed up at my doorstep one morning looking frazzled and desperate. Melanie had always been a bit of a whirlwind, but I had never seen her like this before. She told me that ever since the divorce, things had been falling apart. Now, she had a job interview lined up that could finally turn things around, and she didn't have childcare set up yet and just needed someone to watch her kids for a few hours. It seemed reasonable, and despite knowing how unreliable Melanie could be, I agreed. It was just one day after all, except it wasn't. The next morning, she dropped the kids off again, saying she had a follow-up interview. Then, by the end of the week, she excitedly announced she had gotten the job. I congratulated her, though I was already struggling to juggle my work and her kids, and every morning she would drop them off early and vanish, only returning in the evening to pick them up. At first, I told myself it was temporary. She just needed some time to get settled. But as weeks passed, it became clear Melanie had no intention of finding alternative childcare. She never mentioned looking for a daycare or hiring a sitter. She just kept bringing the kids over like this was some kind of permanent arrangement. I tried dropping hints, mentioning how difficult it was to manage both my job and childcare, pointing out how restless the kids were getting. But she brushed it off every time, and she would always say daycare was expensive and she just needed to get more stable before making any changes. My husband, Mason, 26, male, was sympathetic but hesitant to say anything. He pointed out that Melanie had no one else to rely on. His parents weren't in a position to help, and she was doing this alone. I understood that. But I also understood that it wasn't my responsibility to raise someone else's kids while trying to keep up with my own career. And then little things started standing out. Melanie always showed up in full makeup and dressed way too nicely for someone working a regular office job. I assumed she just wanted to present herself well, but something about it felt off. Then there were the inconsistencies in her schedule. Some days she dropped the kids off later than usual, saying her shift started late. On other days, she picked them up early with no explanation. What kind of job had such unpredictable hours? I brushed it off until the day I saw the social media post. It happened completely by accident. I was scrolling through during my lunch break when I saw a mutual friend had tagged Melanie at a fancy restaurant. The post was from that very afternoon, right in the middle of her supposed work hours. The caption read, "Finally getting some much-needed time to myself. A little self-care never hurt anyone." I frowned, clicking on Melanie's profile, but when I tried to view her posts, most of them were hidden from me. That was odd. She had never blocked me before. Curious, I switched to an old account I rarely used, and from there I could see everything. Dozens of posts, pictures of Melanie on dates, going to brunches, even taking short weekend trips. She wasn't working. She had never had a job. She had been using me for free childcare while she went out and enjoyed her new single life. I felt sick. I had been running myself ragged, trying to balance work and babysitting, while she had been lying to my face the entire time. And it wasn't just the lying, it was the entitlement. She hadn't even bothered to find real childcare. She had manipulated me into doing it for free, under the guise of trying to turn her life around. I stared at my screen, debating what to do. Part of me wanted to call her and let loose, but I knew she'd just come up with more excuses. The kids, I believe, were with their father today, so I decided to wait. Update 1. The next morning, Melanie showed up as usual, all smiles, acting like nothing was wrong. The kids were still groggy from sleep, bundled in their jackets as she tried to usher them inside. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, blocking the entrance. She started with her usual chatter, something about how crazy her schedule was and how she was so lucky to have me helping out. I cut her off and I told her we needed to talk. She blinked in confusion, but I didn't give her a chance to play dumb. I pulled out my phone, opened her social media post, and held it up for her to see. It was a picture of her clinking glasses with some guy at a rooftop bar, posted during the exact time she had supposedly been at work. Her smile froze. I asked her as calmly as I could if she wanted to explain. For a second, she just stared at me, as if scrambling for an excuse. Then she let out a fake laugh, waved it off like it was nothing. She claimed she had been networking and that it was part of her job, and sometimes she had to meet clients in casual settings. I told her to cut the crap. She wasn't networking. She wasn't working, period. She had been dumping her kids on me while she went out on dates, pretending to be some struggling single mom trying to get back on her feet. Her face twisted in irritation. She didn't even bother denying it anymore. Instead, she got defensive, snapping that I was overreacting. She said she deserved to have some fun and that she had been through a rough divorce and she needed to put herself back out there. I told her that was fine. If she wanted to date, that was her business. But she had lied to me. She had used me. I had been bending over backwards, juggling my own work and her kids, all because she made it seem like she had no other choice. She scoffed, rolling her eyes, saying I was making a big deal out of nothing. I told her I was done. She blinked as if she hadn't processed what I said, and I made it very clear. I wasn't babysitting for her anymore. If she needed childcare, she could figure it out herself. Daycares existed. Babysitters existed. She had plenty of options, but I wasn't one of them. That's when she lost it. She started yelling that I was being selfish, that I was making things so much harder for her. She even tried to guilt trip me, saying I was abandoning my own nieces and nephews when they loved spending time with me. I told her they were great kids, but they weren't my responsibility. Her anger turned into desperation. She started grasping at straws, saying she needed to date and that finding a stable man was more important than any job. She even threw out the ridiculous claim that I was sabotaging her kids' future by not helping her find them a father figure. I laughed in disbelief. That was her grand argument, that she needed to trick a man into being a stepdad before she even got a real job? She doubled down, insisting that financial security would come once she had a husband. She even tried to act like she was thinking of the kids' best interest, as if lying to me and dumping them on me for free babysitting was some noble act of motherhood. I told her point blank that I wasn't interested in enabling her delusions. If she wanted a man to take care of her, that was her choice. But she wasn't going to use me as a stepping stone to make it happen. And that's when tears started. Melanie had always been dramatic, and I wasn't falling for it. She sniffled, acting like I had just betrayed her, whining that she was trying her best and I was making things so much harder for her. I stayed firm. I told her she had one last chance. She could take her kids with her right now and figure something else out, or I could call someone to come and get them. Either way, they weren't staying here. She looked stunned. I think she had assumed that no matter what, I wouldn't push her kids out the door, that I'd give in, sigh in frustration, and say, just this one last time. But I was done. I repeated myself. She wasn't leaving the kids here. She tried to argue, saying she just needed a few hours to figure things out, and that she'd come back later. And I told her no. If she had time to find dates, she had time to find childcare. Her face twisted in frustration, and for a moment she looked like she wanted to scream at me, but she knew she had no leverage. She grabbed the kids' hands, huffing that she would remember this and that I was being unbelievably cruel to a struggling mother. I told her she could remember whatever she wanted, but I wasn't changing my mind. She left in a huff, dragging the kids behind her. I stood at the doorway watching her storm off and feeling nothing but relief. I thought that was the end of it, but Melanie wasn't done. Later that day, my husband Mason came home looking concerned. He said Melanie had called him crying, saying I had kicked her kids out and was being cruel to a struggling single mom. I asked him if he believed her. He sighed, shaking his head. He knew Melanie too well, but he still looked torn, like he felt guilty. He reminded me that she didn't have anyone else to rely on. I told him that wasn't my problem. I reminded him that I had been doing both my jobs and hers for weeks, that I had been patient, supportive, and understanding until I found out she was lying. I could see the gears turning in his head. He wasn't happy about the situation, but he couldn't argue with me. Then I dropped the final bombshell. I told him about her ridiculous excuse that finding a father figure was more important than getting a job. His face went blank for a moment, and then he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. He said he'd talk to her. I wasn't sure what that would accomplish, but I appreciated that he was on my side. Update 2. I had expected Melanie to throw a fit, maybe even try to guilt trip me a little more, but I hadn't anticipated just how far she was willing to take it. For the next 2 days, I didn't hear from her. On the third day, my phone buzzed with a notification, a social media post. Melanie had written a long, dramatic post about how certain people in her life had abandoned her in her time of need. She painted herself as a struggling single mom, just trying to do her best, only to be cruelly turned away by someone who should have been there for her. The post didn't mention my name, but it didn't need to. Anyone who knew us could figure out exactly who she was talking about. The comment section was filled with the usual sympathizers. Her friends chimed in with messages like, "You're such a strong mama, you deserve better," and "Some people just don't understand what it's like to be a single mom." Then there were the more pointed comments. "Wow, I can't believe anyone in your family would do that to you. Who needs that kind of negativity in their life? You and your babies deserve better." I rolled my eyes and put my phone down. I wasn't going to engage. I wasn't going to defend myself to a bunch of strangers who had no idea what was actually going on. But Melanie wasn't satisfied with just getting online sympathy. An hour later, my phone rang, and it was my mother-in-law. I debated not answering, but I knew if I ignored her, she'd just keep calling. The moment I picked up, she jumped straight in. She sounded breathless, like she'd been ranting before I even said hello. She asked how I could turn my back on family, saying that Melanie was struggling and that I had humiliated her by refusing to help. I asked her if Melanie had told her the truth, that she wasn't actually working, that she had been lying to me and dumping her kids on me while she went on dates. There was a pause. Then my mother-in-law let out a heavy sigh. She said Melanie might have exaggerated a little, but wasn't it understandable? Wasn't she just trying to get back on her feet? I told her that finding a husband wasn't the same thing as getting back on her feet. She huffed like I was being unreasonable, and then asked why I couldn't just help out for a little while longer. I told her I had my own job, my own responsibilities, and I wasn't going to be manipulated into watching Melanie's kids just because she didn't want to pay for childcare. My mother-in-law sighed again, and this time deeper, like she was so disappointed in me. She said she had hoped I would be more understanding, but if I was going to be so cold about it, then fine. I told her that was perfectly fine by me, and I hung up. I barely had a moment to breathe before my husband Mason walked into the room looking tense. He had just gotten off the phone with his mother. He sighed, rubbing his face, saying he knew this was going to happen. He admitted that his mother had always babied Melanie, and now that Melanie had stirred up drama, she was falling right into her usual role, guilt-tripping everyone into doing what Melanie wanted. I asked him if he thought I had done something wrong. He immediately said no. He knew what his sister was like. He knew she had taken advantage of me, but he also knew that his mother wasn't going to let this go anytime soon. I told him that was her problem, not mine. And that night I got a text from Melanie. It was short, passive-aggressive. She said she hoped I was happy, that my selfishness was going to ruin her kids' future, and that when they grew up to be bitter and broken, it would be my fault. I didn't respond. I thought that was the end of it, but Melanie had one last card to play. The next day, I got another call, and this time from one of Mason's aunts, a woman who usually stayed out of family drama. She sounded hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she should even be calling me. She said she had heard some things and wanted to know my side of the story. I appreciated that. Unlike my mother-in-law, she wasn't jumping to conclusions. So I told her. I laid it all out. The lies, the manipulation, the way Melanie had tried to use me as a free babysitter while she ran around looking for a new husband. The aunt let out a long sigh. She said this wasn't the first time Melanie had pulled something like this. Apparently, before the divorce, Melanie had a habit of leaning on family whenever she wanted an easy way out of responsibility. Then she said something that stuck with me. She said, "You know, it's funny. When Melanie needs something, she talks about family nonstop. But when she's fine, when she's got what she wants, she doesn't even bother checking in on the rest of us." That hit me because it was true. Melanie only talked about family, helping family when it benefited her. I thanked the aunt for calling, and she told me to just ignore the drama. She said people like Melanie thrived on attention, and the best thing I could do was refuse to give her any. She was right. So that's exactly what I did. Melanie kept up the pity party online for another few days, but when she realized I wasn't engaging, she slowly lost steam. The comments dwindled and the sympathy dried up, and just like that, she moved on. Update 3. A week later, I got another text, and this time it wasn't from Melanie, it was from Mason's mother. And all it said was, "I hope you're ready to live with the consequences of your actions." I had no idea what she meant, but I was about to find out. It was dramatic, vague, and completely unnecessary, exactly like something she'd say when she was trying to stir up trouble. I showed the message to Mason and asked if he had any idea what she was talking about. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair, saying that if his mom was getting this worked up, it meant Melanie was up to something again. He told me to just ignore it, that it was probably another round of guilt tripping. But I had a bad feeling, and I was right. The next morning I got another call, and this time it was from Mason's cousin, who worked at a local daycare. She sounded hesitant, almost embarrassed, as she asked if I had any plans to pick up the kids later today. She quickly explained. Melanie had shown up at the daycare that morning and told them that Auntie would be picking up the kids at the end of the day. She had paid for one day, claiming she had an emergency appointment and couldn't find another babysitter. She had left my name, my number, and my address on the emergency contact form, and she had just assumed I would take the kids. No, she had counted on it. I took a deep breath and told the cousin that no, I had not agreed to do any of this, and no, I would not be picking them up. The cousin sounded relieved. She said she had a bad feeling about it, which was why she had called me first before assuming Melanie was telling the truth. She said she'd handle it and let the daycare know that if Melanie didn't come back, they would call child services. I thanked her and then immediately called Melanie. She didn't pick up. Of course she didn't, so I sent her a message instead. I don't know what you're thinking about, but I am not picking up your kids. Figure it out yourself. Not even 5 minutes later, she responded. She called me heartless. She called me spiteful. She said she couldn't believe I would be so cruel to my own nieces and nephews. And then she tried to guilt trip me again. She said she had a date with a man who could be the father figure her kids desperately needed, and that I was sabotaging their future by refusing to help. I almost laughed out loud. How many dates did she go on in a day, and for how long? Did she just go on dates back to back looking for a stepfather? This woman had the audacity to try to dump her kids on me again, and this time through a daycare, and was now acting like I was personally ruining her children's lives because I wouldn't go along with it. I told her that her children were her responsibility, and if she kept trying to shove them onto other people under false pretenses, she was going to end up in serious trouble. She fired back with something about how family is supposed to help each other, how I was obsessed with punishing her, and how she wouldn't forget this betrayal. I told her to do whatever she wanted, but I was done. I blocked her. I blocked her on social media, on my phone, and in every possible way she could contact me. Then I told Mason what happened. He wasn't surprised, just exhausted. He said this was exactly why he had always kept his distance from Melanie. She had always been like this, entitled, selfish, and manipulative. I asked him if he thought his mom had known about Melanie's little daycare stunt. He hesitated, then admitted that she probably did. That explained the text message. "I hope you're ready to live with the consequences of your actions." His mom had known what Melanie was planning, and she had blamed me in advance as if I was the one being unreasonable. Mason sighed and ran a hand down his face. Then he said, "I think it's time we stop dealing with them altogether." I had never loved him more than in that moment. Update 4. A week passed with no contact. Then, one evening, Mason got a call from his mother. She left a voicemail. She was furious. She accused us of turning our backs on family, of leaving poor Melanie to fend for herself, and of abandoning 2 innocent children when we had the resources to help. Then she said something that made Mason pause. "I hope you two don't think you can come around during the holidays and pretend everything's fine. Family isn't just something you pick and choose when it's convenient for you." I saw the way Mason's jaw tightened as he listened to the message. Then he deleted it without responding. He turned to me and said, "I think we just got ourselves uninvited from Thanksgiving." I grinned and told him that was the best news I'd heard all week. We agreed then and there. We were done with them. No more entertaining their guilt trips. No more trying to be the bigger people. No more letting them manipulate us into cleaning up Melanie's messes. The answer would always be no, because she was demanding something we weren't willing to give. Update 5. Melanie must have realized that guilt tripping wasn't working anymore because she changed her approach. A few days after we shut down my mother-in-law's rant about the holidays, Melanie tried calling Mason. He didn't answer. Then she tried me. I didn't answer either, so she left a voicemail. She sounded calm, too calm. It worried me more than anything. She said she wanted to clear the air and that she was willing to be reasonable if we were. Since when had she ever been reasonable? Mason rolled his eyes and ignored the message. We both knew what she was trying to do, lure us into a conversation where she could twist things around and make us the villains again. But when she realized we weren't taking the bait, she switched tactics again. She showed up at our house. We were in the middle of eating dinner when we heard the knock. At first we ignored it, and then the knocking turned into pounding. Mason sighed, got up, and opened the door just enough to see who it was. Melanie stood there looking frustrated but not angry, more like desperate. She said she just wanted to talk, and Mason told her we had already said everything that needed to be said. She asked if she could at least come inside because it was cold outside. He shut that down fast, saying that whatever she had to say, she could say it right there on the porch. And then, without shame, Melanie launched into her speech. She claimed she understood why I was mad and why we were upset about what happened at the daycare. She even admitted that maybe she should have been more honest with me from the start. But then she said something that nearly made me choke on my drink. She expected me to understand that she was just trying to do what was best for her kids, and that meant finding them a father figure. She insisted that getting a job wasn't as important as making sure they had a stable home with a strong male role model. Mason scoffed, and I put down my fork. I walked to the door, looked her dead in the eye, and told her that if Mason and I wanted kids, we would have kids. But we didn't, and we sure as hell weren't going to play house with hers. She blinked, looking genuinely stunned for a moment before recovering. She argued that we had a home, we had stability, and she had just thought. Mason cut her off. What she thought, he said, was that she could just dump her responsibilities on us. But that wasn't happening. We weren't some type of co-parents. Melanie started getting defensive, saying she wasn't asking us to raise her kids, just to help out until she got on her feet. Mason shook his head. No, he told her. She hadn't asked. She had assumed. She had decided that we owed her, but we didn't. Melanie's face twisted with frustration. She turned to me and asked if I could at least admit that she was trying, that she was making an effort to build a better life for her kids. I folded my arms and told her that effort didn't mean lying to people, sneaking around, dumping her kids on others so that she could go on dates. If she really wanted a better life for them, she would get a real job and start acting like a responsible parent. She let out a sharp laugh and said I just didn't get it. I didn't have kids, so how could I possibly understand what it was like? And that's when Mason delivered the final blow. She was right, he said. We didn't have kids, and that was exactly why we weren't going to spend our money and time raising someone else's. From now on, if she tried to abandon her kids with us again, he would hand them straight over to their father, who was supposed to be their strong father figure, and file a complaint for child neglect. Melanie paled. She tried to stammer out a response, but Mason wasn't done. He made it clear that the same warning applied to their mother too. If she thought she could keep enabling Melanie and guilting us into playing along, she was going to find herself cut off just like her daughter. Melanie's face twisted into something ugly as she accused us of being heartless, of turning our backs on family, of choosing money over people. Mason didn't say anything. He just closed the door in her face. That night, as I sat back with a glass of wine, I thought about everything, the way Melanie had lied, the way my mother-in-law had excused it, and the way they both assumed Mason and I would just fall in line. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how little any of it actually mattered. Mason and I weren't the kind of people who lived our lives online. We barely posted, rarely engaged, and never cared about who was saying what. That was probably why I hadn't reacted to Melanie's ridiculous post when I first saw it. Because what was the point? A handful of people had seen it, maybe 50 at most, and none of them were people whose opinions I cared about. It wasn't worth the energy. And that was the difference between us. Melanie needed an audience. She needed attention. She needed people to rally behind her. But Mason and I, we didn't need validation from anyone, least of all her. So if she thought she could run to family and play the victim, twisting the story to make us look cruel, she was wasting her time. The ones who actually knew us, they already understood that we didn't entertain nonsense. She could cry, she could rant, she could paint herself as a martyr. None of it would change reality, and the reality was simple. Mason and I didn't owe her anything. Mason glanced over at me and asked if I felt better. I grinned and told him I felt so much better. We sat back, finished our wine, and enjoyed the quiet. Stay tuned for more stories from our girl relationships.